We are live on Instagram. We are live on Facebook. Welcome to the PT on Ice Daily Show, brought to you by the Institute of Clinical Excellence. My name is Dustin Jones, one of two lead faculty members within the older adult division. If you're listening on to the podcast, thank you for doing so. But check out these videos sometimes if you're able. The podcast is great. The videos are even better. We are live every weekday morning at 9 a.m. Jeff Musgrave, what's up, man? So today I want to talk about when is high intensity training or HIIT bad for older adults. So this topic stems from a question from a listener. And I want to start off by saying thank you to said listener who replied to the Hump Day Hustle email that goes out every Wednesday at 8:30. He replied and asked a question about, I'll just read this verbatim. I was wondering if you had ever heard of high intensity training having deleterious effects on older adults. We love these types of questions. We love it when you all engage with the content, whether it's on here, on Instagram, Facebook, the Hump Day Hustle email. Ask us questions because that gives us a chance to reflect on what we say, dig into the research some, and just help us iron out some of these things that we discuss. I think it's good for everyone involved, so encourage you all to do so. So this question, I wanted to do a PT on Ice episode about. I'll read that question again. I was wondering if you had ever heard of high intensity training having I cannot say this word at all, deleterious effects on older adults. Now, this is a great question because we often advocate for higher intensity activities. If you listen to this podcast for any period of time, that one of the biggest issues within the world of geriatric rehabilitation, even geriatric fitness, is that exercise is often underdosed. It does not reach an adequate intensity to promote a positive adaptation, or the intensity is not high enough to where we may be leaving a lot on the table in terms of how much progress or change that we can achieve with our patients. However, on the flip side, what is too much? When are we causing harm? When is too much a bad thing? And these are questions that we need to look into and have a solid answer for. And so I wanted to discuss that today. There's a few different areas that I think we should speak to in terms of high intensity training and when it may be an issue with older adults or a bad idea. The first one is the obvious one that we all hopefully learn in our formal training, but are very aware of, and these are these absolute and relative contraindications to exercise. I will put a link on the Facebook video to the Merck manual, which is a very simple layout that gives you an idea of what are some of these absolute and relative contraindications to exercise. But by and large, much of it is unstable cardiovascular, cardiopulmonary issues. So when you read this list, many of the folks that we're going to be working with, especially community-dwelling older adults, we need to have this on our radar, but it may not necessarily be something we come across. Definitely more pertinent to the folks in more acute settings, in acute care, in acute rehab facilities, things along those lines. You need to be very on top of some of these absolute and relative contraindications. Remember, I'll post that link on the Facebook video, but typically they're unstable cardiovascular, cardiopulmonary conditions that we want to be aware of. Also vital signs. So if you're checking vitals, the parameters to know that, okay, probably need to stop or hold off on exercise or be cautious. I will post those resources on the Facebook video. I don't want to go into too much detail in this podcast due to the format. The second thing we want to think about are those acute situations, an acute injury, or maybe a fracture, for example, that high intensity training for older adults may not be the best thing possible. However, we have to say that with the caveat that we can provide some pretty helpful modifications so people can receive that high intensity stimulus without irritating that acute injury or that acute situation. Obviously, it's something you all think about, but I think it needs to be stated. The last thing with this section is irritability. We want irritability to really be our guide. That's why we definitely speak to the symptom behavior model within the Institute of Clinical Excellence, especially in the rehabilitation setting. We're trying to really get people stronger to build their capacity. We are going to be using some higher intensity training. The behavior of their symptoms is going to help us guide what exercise we may do or may not do, the dosage, how much volume, the intensity, so on and so forth. Is going to be very helpful in making those decisions. So that's the first thing I want to speak to. That's when we may want to really reconsider high intensity training for older adults. There's lots of ways that we can get around that. The second category I wanted to speak to, which is from my perspective in going into the research, is chronic kidney disease. There have been several studies that have shown how harmful high-intensity training can be to individuals with chronic kidney disease, whether they're on dialysis or whether they're not on dialysis. So typically what you'll see is elevated creatinine levels or other urinary biomarkers that indicate acute kidney damage, that people will go through an intense training session and they'll have some of those elevated markers. You'll even see this in healthy individuals, healthy trained individuals. And so we need to be aware of this. And for a young individual, let's say Alan, for example, is just getting after it. The guy works out for 2 to 3 hours a day. He probably has some of these elevated levels in his urine. However, what's the net result of that training? It's not that he's going to have chronic kidney disease. He's going to be a freaking beast, and he's going to be very strong and have amazing endurance, and he looks good too. You know, he looks really good. So there's a lot of positive effects of that exercise, and those positive effects heavily outweigh some of the negative consequences of high-intensity training. However, if we take someone that's more on that frailty spectrum that has a diagnosis of chronic kidney disease, they have those chronically elevated markers, a high-intensity training session, we really have to think, is this going to have a net negative or a net positive? And I would argue with many of the folks that we're working with in that particular situation, the strength that they will gain, the endurance that they will gain, the activity that they get with a high-intensity session is going to outweigh some of the drawbacks of maybe potentially more of an acute kidney injury, if you will. Obviously, that is case dependent, but we want to get people moving and we want to achieve an adequate intensity. But much of the literature speaks to a lot of those elevated markers can be prevented if we're very progressive, or how should I say this, thoughtful in how we progress these activities. So not going from day one with an individual that may not be used to exercising and their prior levels of physical activity are relatively low, and we come in guns ablaze and try and get them to reach the ACSM recommended exercise guidelines day one. That's probably not great. We want to have a gradual progression of the volume of activity and also the intensity of that activity, and that can blunt some of those spikes and some of those urinary biomarkers. And so the gradual progression is going to be huge. So with these individuals, it may be intentional underdosage initially to really ramp up their volume and then their intensity as time goes by. Now, I know that time is of the essence with a lot of these individuals, and we may not get a lot of time or a lot of visits. So this is where education, a lot of just counseling and really helping them understand the gradual progression of their volume and intensity over time, maybe even beyond a point that you're actually working with them. So that's what we need to think about. Gradual progression of the volume and intensity with folks that have chronic kidney disease can blunt a lot of those responses. But I think the big question we have to ask is, what is the risk of some of those elevated biomarkers? But then also, what are the positive impacts that we could have with this exercise with high intensity training? And oftentimes, we're going to prefer getting that high intensity training session in, even at the expense of potentially elevated urinary biomarkers, if that is warranted. And this is typically a conversation with the physician, and typically there's a nurse on case as well, at least in the home health setting. That's been my experience. So chronic kidney disease, that's one that we want to think about cautiously with individuals. The next one, and this was kind of referenced in that initial email, was the extreme exercise hypothesis. Some of you all may have read about this in reference to chronic cardio. James O'Keefe is a physician that has some pretty interesting articles really talking about chronic cardio. I remember the first time I read some of his stuff, it was back in like 2012, 2013, where he was documenting some of the cardiovascular damage that some marathon racers underwent over a period of 26.2 miles. And it was rather astounding. Also documenting some cases of a heart attack and even stroke in some cases with some of this chronic cardio type of training. And so the question in the email was speaking more to this chronic cardio or the extreme exercise hypothesis and how that's been shown to be harmful for individuals. Is it harmful for older adults? How do we think about this? So when you dive into that literature, by far the most common intervention that they are studying is steady state endurance-based activities. So we're talking relatively high intensity running or cycling, things where you're doing the same thing over and over and over again. Sometimes people averaging over 20 miles a day, for example, with running, and cycling can be much more. These are people that are kind of on that extreme of doing the same thing over and over and over again. Steady state cardio is kind of what we would talk at a relatively high intensity. We're not advocating for that. We are not really promoting that in our courses, in our content on the PT on Ice Daily Show. What we're advocating for is a more balanced approach, something that's more in line with some of the ACSM recommended guidelines. We're not going to completely ignore some of that steady state training. We know that we want to get roughly 150 to 300 minutes of that per week at a moderate intensity, or 75 to 150 minutes of that at a higher intensity. But then that's also coupled with adequately dosed strength training at least 2 times a week. If we get more of that, great, but we need to be dialed into sleep, nutrition, subjective report as well. But people can handle a whole lot more when it's a more balanced approach and you're not going to the extremes of one or the other. And that's what we're really advocating for, is that evidence-based, practical, that balanced approach. And you're not going to see a lot of these issues with this extreme exercise hypothesis. So all that to say, we need to be aware of this, but for the vast majority of the individuals that we're working with, this is not going to be a concern. Maybe if you were working with the masters athlete, individual that is very competitive and is logging a lot of miles on the bike or on the road or on the trail, that yeah, we may need to dial back some of their volume and implement some more cross training or strength training along those lines. But for the vast majority of the people that we are going to be seeing, that's not the case. And that's good news. That's something that I think, we need to be encouraged by. So the absolute and relative contraindications, we need to know those. We need to be aware of them. We need to be respectful of irritability as well, and also acute situations. Chronic kidney disease is one that's been documented in the literature, that high-intensity training can be harmful in terms of those urinary biomarkers. However, got to weigh the pros and the cons of that. Oftentimes, high-intensity training is going to be net positive for these individuals. And then also we need to think about that extreme exercise hypothesis. However, we're not advocating for the extreme of, hitting the pavement for over 20 miles a day, 5 days a week. What we're advocating for is that balanced approach, a mix of some of that endurance-based training with some high-intensity interval training, and then also adequate strength training to get a stimulus. But I want to wrap this up just by giving context to this situation, and Alan speaks to this really well. He did in this email conversation that we had with this ICE listener, and we need to have a good dose of perspective with this situation. We have a problem, folks. We have an issue. We have a problem with chronic disease. It is one of the biggest threats to the health of our country in many different ways. It is a big issue. It's one of the biggest threats to our independence and the overall health and wellness of this country. And so if we're going to really speak to the risk of high intensity training, we need to be very, very careful of creating a culture of fear around exercise. We don't want to create a culture of fear around higher intensity exercise. And I really need to think, we need to ask the question, what is achieved by that? What is achieved by us creating this culture of fear, culture of caution around high intensity activities? If we're honest with ourselves, we can say, okay, how many adverse events do we prevent? And based on the literature, there could be some adverse events, but they're very, very rare in individuals. And you take the other side of that, how many people do we scare out of exercise? How many people that are exercising do we scare out of achieving a high enough intensity to actually get a positive adaptation and stimulus? What is achieved by creating a culture of caution around high intensity exercise? And we may be doing more harm than good. I know we love to get on Instagram and Twitter and our little PT bubbles and really hate on, higher intensity activities and always think about all the negatives and the downsides. And yes, we want to be aware of that. But are we really going to be pushing that to our patients, to the people that need to get moving? We want to not create a culture of caution around high intensity exercise, but encourage people to achieve an adequate stimulus to be able to get positive adaptations. That's my opinion. I'd love to hear your all's thoughts, but we need to be very careful about that, because if people are afraid to achieve, that 5 to 6 out of 10 RPE when they're performing resistance training, we're going to be in trouble. We're not going to get people much stronger, and they're going to continue wasting their time performing underdosed activity on their own or even in the rehab setting. So those are my thoughts. When high intensity training is bad for older adults, very, very few cases, the vast majority of people that we're going to be working with, we can definitely leverage higher intensity training, especially when we are leveraging something like subjective report and RPE. That's going to be very, very helpful for folks. All right, let me know your thoughts, whether it's on Instagram, whether you're on Facebook, the podcast, or the Hump Day Hustle email list. Shoot reply, and Jeff will get that to the appropriate faculty. We love to engage on these topics and these conversations just so we can kind of, sharpen the sword, if you will, in terms of how we think about these things. Before we go, I do want to mention Modern Management of the Older Adult Essential Foundations. So that's our first online course. All right, our second one is Advanced Concepts. So the first one, Essential Foundations, is 8 weeks online. That is starting September 2nd. That's good for 16 CEUs. It's a cohort style. You have a weekly assignment where you apply the material, and then we have a bi-weekly discussion where we go through case examples and also give feedback on the homework. 8 weeks goes by rather quickly, but you walk away as a completely changed individual and clinician. Once you've completed Essential Foundations, then you can go to Advanced Concepts. That next cohort is starting September 9th. And then we're also getting back in the swing of things with our live 2-day course. So I'm excited about that. All right. Thanks for hanging out with me, y'all, on a lovely Wednesday. Jerry on Ice. Hope you're having a good day so far. Hope that continues. And I'll talk to you soon. See ya.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the PT on Ice Daily Show. If you enjoyed this content, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. And be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Institute of Clinical Excellence. If you're interested in getting plugged into more ICE content on a weekly basis while earning CEUs from home, check out our virtual ICE online mentorship program at ptonice.com. While you're there, sign up for our Hump Day Hustling newsletter for a free email every Wednesday morning with our top 5 research articles and social media posts that we think are worth reading. Head over to ptonice.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up.